In this episode, dear friends, we are talking about the maps, old maps. Who doesn't like them, right? So these are the maps. You see them in front of you, and you also see them on the page. So anytime you want to refer back to them, you can go on your webinar page, and they're all numbered in there. You can review them, you can look closer, but they also will be given to you throughout this episode. You will see them on screen as I talk about them. And these are the maps of how Asia was perceived in 16th, 17th century, the Grand Tartaria, or Great Tartaria, we can also call it, which we know nothing about. I bet you had no idea there was Great Tartaria occupying most of Asia, what is today Siberia, stretching into China, into India, etc. Actually, India was called the Mughal Empire, not where Mongolia is. It's India that was called that. So let's start reviewing the maps. This episode is all about the maps. So we will just look at them, and just by looking at these proofs, which are again in plain sight in front of you, you will see what was really going on and what wasn't going on, okay? And so we'll see here everything, where Europe was located, what the Grand Tartaria was, etc., etc. We will go into Russia, into Moscovia, and into many other things. So map number 1, you see here in green this humongous territory occupied by the Grand Tartaria. Well, as you see the map, which is the late 16th century map, if I'm reading the date correctly, is pretty accurate. When you think about it, look at how Europe is designated. Europe is on the left side, left upper corner, right? Then we have Persia. As you see, the map is actually French. That's the French map. The northern territories, which is the Arctic, they are kind of pretty accurate. And you see the Arctic Ocean is called something absolutely different. Septentrional, that's what the name here indicates. You will see this name throughout. And here it says Grand Tartarie, which is the Great Tartaria or Grand Tartaria. And it occupies the territory of Russian Siberia in the Far East and goes much further, includes incidentally both Koreas. If you look at this map, goes very deeply into what is today's China. Of course, the Mongolian Tibet is included here. It's not indicated in this map, but Tibet is here, a large part of China. You see, China is actually a lot smaller. What do we see with India? It says Indi, and then it says Empire du Mughal, which is Mughal Empire. And I will stop at that, and I will explain later to you in the next segment what these words really mean. Tartaria or Tartari, right? And Mughal or Mongol. I will explain them to you in the next segment. Right now we're looking at maps. Of course, you see Persia in pink, right? You see Arabia in yellow, and you see Turkey. Then you see, of course, Europe, which is beyond the map. So it's on the left of the map, upper left corner. So this is a very simple map. I just wanted to show you overall so you get this first perspective on it. Now, the next map, map number 2, is very detailed. As you see, Eurasia does not look exactly like we're used to it, okay? But that said, there are very interesting discoveries we will make right away in this map. First of all, in pink, this giant mass to the right, upper right corner, that's your Great Tartaria or Grand Tartaria. You can see that. Incidentally, this is also a French map, and this map is from, I believe, 17th century. It's very hard to read the date here. So what do we have here? This gigantic Grand Tartaria, which is the entire Siberia, part of Arctic Circle, goes all the way in the west to the Caspian Sea. So basically around the Ural Mountains, and then all the way to the Caspian Sea, where the Empire of Persia is, it cleaves into that. So part of it is also what we know today as the Middle East, such as a little bit of Afghanistan, Iraq, maybe Iran, those places. And then we have this very large empire, which is a Mughal empire, which we know as India today, and China. All that is not as clear. But our focus is the Great Tartaria. And also in the north here on this map, inside Great Tartaria, you see different areas. And for example, there is in the north Mol, Mongol, Magog. You can see that. Okay, so these are geographically designated or different parts of the Great Tartaria. Now look to the left of the Great Tartaria and you will see a very interesting thing. It says here White Russia, Russie Blanc, right? And then Moscovia. So White Russia / Moscovia, all that big territory was White Russia. In other words, also known as Moscovia. And it goes all the way to the north. Now, left of that, which is west of White Russia / Moscovia, you know, today, just to remind you all, White Russia is what? That's Belarus. Okay, this includes Belarus and the rest of the European part of Russia, basically. There are some where you see Black Sea, you see some green area, and it's actually impossible to read, so I can't even tell you. There are certain areas that were under the control of Persia or Ottoman Empire. At the time, it wasn't really even, you see, Ottoman Empire is not even indicated here as the empire. So that's also very interesting to note. So we have left of that, which is west of Russia, White Russia, and the Great Tartaria, we have what? We have Europe, right? And it says here, Partie d'Europe. Excuse my French, please. My French is not terrific at all. But you can read it for yourself. What does this tell us? This tells us already a very interesting clue about Europe. Europe was a part of what we today know as Eurasia. It was not a separate continent. And I will expand on that. You remember in the previous webinar, I told you, I revealed already this mystery. I actually did not leave you hanging. So you already know that there was no Eurasia. There was Asia. So Europe at one point was just simply a part of big giant continent of Asia, Asia. You obviously, Asia is screwed up, anglicized the pronunciation of it, but in Russian it sounds as Asia. In some languages, such as Romanic languages, it was sound like Asia, and that was a land of Aces or Az. That's what Asia was. So Europe was a part of Asia, just like Grand Tartaria, just like Mughal Empire, and just like White Russia, Russie Blanc, right? Белая Россия. So that was Moscovia and White Russia here are equated. This is not the only map like this, incidentally. There are other maps in which Moscovia is equated with White Russia. We will see this below, I believe. Yes, we do see this below on map 3. So we're proceeding to map 3, which says, this is the map, this map announces to us, this is the map of La Gran Tartaria. And this is Italian, which I speak better, so I can give you a more accurate pronunciation. So La Gran Tartaria. And the year of this map is 1683. Very small letters, but we can do it. And here we have even more details. And it's sort of like a similar kind of misshapen, not how we know northern parts of Russia. You know, it kind of misses some corners. And some people might say, but there are a lot of things missing here, right? Well, sure, at the time, let me explain why that is. Number one, at the time, only for about maybe 1 or 2 centuries, Western Europeans started exploring, what we call exploring, but in reality, they were looking for lands to colonize, to steal from other people, to occupy, right? That's what they were looking for. So the art of this very accurate map making made its way into Western society only around maybe 15th century. Then 16th and 17th, that was the pinnacle of when everybody was making maps. And these maps are very important. There are these master map makers, and these maps are some of them. And of course, the French and the Italians were amongst the most prominent explorers, as we well know, at the time. So this is very clear why they were making these very detailed maps. And this next map is, in reality, is very detailed and very impressive. And we will see some others which are also quite impressive. And I'm going to give you even more details here. So what do we have here on this Italian map? Again, Oceano Settentrionale, right? Nothing to do with Arctic, right? Interesting. Although, remember, I explained to you in webinar 8, we never got the chance to talk about the Arctic, and maybe I'll mention it in the following episode, but you remember A-R, Arian, right? Orion, Arctic Rus, in other words, Hyperborea, as it's more commonly known, and Arctic Rus, that's where people from Orion, that the seeding occurred. It was the flourishing land before it got covered with ices during the Ice Age. And then people had to move out and move south and move west, wherever they could move in order to survive. And that's also, that coincided with that humongous plunge in consciousness, and we are talking very ancient days. So Arctic, Arctica, Arctic Rus, there was also this lost city of Archaim, which is supposedly located, that's the theory, but nobody can find it, was located in the very northern Urals, beyond the Arctic Circle, near the Arctic Ocean. So that was one of the, you remember also I mentioned Arcona. So all these words, all these roots come from the same origin, R and then con. Con is the yin-yang, is the circle, is the complete ultimate circle of life, is the alpha and omega. So Arctic, Arcona, Archaim, right? Then we will talk about Antarctica as well. These are very important and useful words to remember. However, we are talking Western European exploration, which is already that period in which Europeans started taking over the world, that excessively yang, that's very aggressive. Nothing wrong with yang, only when it becomes very aggressive, negative, greedy, when consciousness falls so low that either yin or yang is expressed in a very imbalanced way, in a very disharmonious way. This is what was happening. Greed took over, anger took over, pride took over, but especially greed. That was the time of great fear, but especially great greed. And we still have countries like that. Well, US is called land of the greed, basically. But let's get back to the map. And what do we see here? Let's look at what is happening around the Arctic Circle and the Arctic Sea, Oceano Settentrionale. We see here very interesting things. You see this big giant land which is located right under the sign Oceano Settentrionale. It's called Nova Zemlya, right? You see that. And it's not very accurately depicted. I'll show it to you later on other maps, including the contemporary map, and it looks different than that. So it's not very accurately depicted, but it's not that bad, actually, considering when the map was made. And what is Nova Zemlya? It's Novaya Zemlya, and I'm saying this to you in Russian. Zemlya in Russian means land. Nova or Novaya means new. Well, that doesn't even require translation, right? And so Novaya Zemlya, in other words, was called the same way in 15th, 16th century. Everybody knew it because you will see on other maps the same thing. Well, New Zemlya, in other words, new land, was not new even in 15th, 16th century, okay? And now look to the reason I'm focusing so much on this island, an island, incidentally, as we know it today. Here, it is depicted as having a link to the mainland, well, which is not the case today. And I will also explain to you why there might be a discrepancy here. It may not mean that they are such bad cartographers. It simply might mean that in those days there might have been some connection to the land, as there might have been no islands or certain pieces of the land that are available today. Why is that? Well, incidentally, or here's an example for you, how landmass might change even within several centuries. It might have been covered by ice, some parts of it, and some might have been exposed as land. Some might have been more under the sea and others were more risen. That's very possible too. Example, just now, several days ago, there was an announcement that 2 school kids in Russia discovered a new island in the Arctic. And that's not a joke, and it's not a tiny island. It's not a huge island, but it is a serious piece of land which nobody knew existed. And the reason for that is not because everybody was overlooking it or nobody was paying attention. It actually because ices are melting. That land just appeared, and the kids discovered it through some kind of research, through Google Earth, etc. It's for real. It has been confirmed. They have been awarded an award for discovering a new piece of land. Not a joke, absolutely seriously. Just heard it in the news several days ago. 2 Russian kids. So we are focusing on Novaya Zemlya, this very famous island where nobody lives because it's all covered in ice and it's extremely cold, but there are some scientific labs there, exploration labs, and also I believe there is also a base, Russian base there, because it kind of protrudes very much into the Arctic Ocean. And now look to the left of Novaya Zemlya and look to the right of it. What does it say? Mare di Moscovia, which is the Sea of Moscow, or Moscovia. Note, this is what? 17th century. In 16th century maps, I couldn't find something that would not be very blurry in a bad resolution, but in 16th century maps, they would say the same thing. Okay, pay attention to this because it's all very important. And to the right, it says Mare di Tartaria, which is what? The Sea of Tartaria. There is no other sea anywhere to the right of the Sea of Tartaria. And if you look at the contemporary map, which will be number 7 and number 8 in our list, so you can actually go down there and you will see that there are several seas that go all the way to the Far East, and then there is only Kamchatka there. Then, you know, that's the end of Eurasia. So you can actually look further. You have the Bering Strait. So before Bering Strait, which is the strait separating the tip of the Far East, Russian Far East, from Alaska on the other side, you have several seas. If you look at map 8, you will see them very clearly. And so here you see Novaya Zemlya, looking at map 8 right now, Novaya Zemlya on the contemporary map. And you see what it looks like. It is between Barents Sea and Kara Sea, or Karskaya More. And then several other seas, Море Laptevik, the Laptev Sea, Восточно-Сибирское море, the Siberian Sea, and then Chukcha Sea, etc., etc. Okay, so that map is incomplete. It does not have that end, which might have been covered by ice, and there might have not been any access to it. It might have been perceived as part of the sea, perhaps, that is covered by ice. That's very possible. But the point here I want to make is that there are 2 seas as perceived back then in the Arctic, to the left of Novaya Zemlya, or to the west, Moscow Sea, to the right, the huge Sea of Tartaria. And after that, we see to the right to the east, the Sea of Kiamachiti or something like that. And that would be, Kaimachiti, that would be Kamchatka, what is today known as Kamchatka, and the people who live in Kamchatka are called Kamchadals, Kamchadali in Russian. Well, that is referring to them, obviously, with Italian accent, let's just say. Okay, so there are no islands, no other seas that way. All right, we'll buy that. Why not? But the point is that, see, to the west of that gigantic Asian mass with a little bit of Europe, we see the territory of, again, on the same map, Russia Blanca, White Russia, and then Moscovia underneath, which is equated, again, it's not a separate thing, like some people want us to believe, like a big deal with what Ukrainians, this crazed Ukrainian Ukronazis and nationalists are saying, that Moscovia was nothing. It was Moscovia and White Russia simultaneously, and it was gigantic, as you see. That's this whole western side of this map number 3. And the sea in the north belonged with Moscovia as well. And the reason for that, of course, was because the capital was in Moscow. That's why it had 2 names, White Russia and Moscovia at the same time. But look at this humongous Tartaria again. See, there are several names here. Up in the north, you see Tartaria settentrionale, and then Vera Tartaria. Remember, we discussed this word vero. Vero means true in Italian, or also Vera, which is a Russian word, means face. Well, which is very, very easy transition from true. So this is the true Tartaria, is located near the Arctic Circle there, around the Arctic Circle, which again, remember, this was once Arctic Rus, all of that. Arctic Rus. It was Hyperborea. It was that flourishing land. So it remained. It seems like people lived there. True Tartaria, you know. Let's pay attention here, right? True Tartaria, not just any other Tartaria, but real true Tartaria. And then we have several other Tartarias within this whole big grand Tartaria, which were somehow divided into areas, into regions, by where the Ural Mountains would be, you know, this green area, which is between Russia, Blanca, and the Grand Tartaria proper. You see Tartaria Deserta, and that's desert Tartaria, basically. Then you also see some other Tartaro di Samarkand. Samarkand is a part of Uzbekistan today, incidentally, very ancient city. And through the city of Samarkand lay the famous Silk Road. That was the center of trade between Russia and the West, and going into India and China. So this is a big deal, in other words. What else do we see here? We see Tibet. If you look below, you will see Tibet, right? Big, giant Tibet here, okay? You see Katai of China. Oh yes, the Grand Mogol. This is part of the Grand Mogol, it says here, all the way to the south of this map. And then part of Persia, part of China, gives you parts of those. And just keep paying attention, because we will continue going into more details. Now let's look at map number 4. And here again, confirmation of what I told you before. If you look to the very left, northern left corner, northwestern corner of this map, number 4, you will see very elaborate letters, but it basically says that this is Europe, or European part. Okay, again, it only gives you Europe as that part, little part. So from that perspective, those who actually say that Europe is Europe and Russia is Russia and they're separate, they're apparently not that wrong, at least from the perspective of Western Europeans, even in those days. Well, today we define European continent as the one that stretches from western parts, which are the British Isles, to the very east, which is the Ural Mountains, and then the Caspian Sea, and then it just cuts off at Caspian Sea, then Caucasus, and into the Black Sea and Mediterranean. That's your Europe, you know, northern part of Black Sea, northern part of Mediterranean, and that's how it circles around. This is your Europe. That's today's understanding. But I have a sneaking suspicion that at one point it was not so. And I kept explaining to you that the whole continent was in fact called Asia. And then Europe was a part of it. Then White Russia was a part of it, which includes, as we see, a pretty large territory. Again, it says Moscovia here. You will notice on this map, it has slightly different names to things. I also want to draw your attention right underneath Moscovia. It says Crimea, in other words, but it does not say it on the peninsula of Crimea. Do you see where it's located? The peninsula of Crimea is like all the way in the corner, this triangular little greenish mass, where the Black Sea is protruding into the Black Sea. And Crimea is where basically southern Russia is, and a large part of Ukraine, I would say, as well, or at least eastern Ukraine. So all that was Crimea, according to this map, unless they're not being very accurate here. This map also has a few other interesting things here. Look at Armenia. In the lower left corner here, you will see Armenia, which is marked as pretty large. And this is about all we can see on this map, because it's a very, very small font here. I can't really read. Maybe you will be able to read on your own a little bit more. But it also tells us here that this is a map. Look in the lower right corner. It says here that this is the map of Tartaria. It actually confirms the same exact thing. It's a very detailed map, but very, very hard to read. We're proceeding to map number 5. And again, what do you see here? In the upper left corner, you see Novaya Zemlya, you know? Again, Zemlya, new land. And you see Tartaricus, Oceanus Tartaricus. This map is actually in Latin, and it could have been made by anybody. But it's interesting that here they don't call it the Sea of Tartaria, they call it Ocean of Tartaria, or Tartar Ocean. And here on this map, we are looking at the magnified part of the northern Tartaria. This is what I wanted to show you. There are other interesting things here which are noticeable when you look closer. For example, about center, all the way to the left, you will see the word Siberia. Siberia. Siberia, in other words. Siberia is basically a small section, not the giant Siberia as we perceive it today, according to this map. And when you look at it closer, see, it's basically Novaya Zemlya is located just about north of the Ural Mountains. So Siberia, according to this map, is where the Ural Mountains more or less were, or are in this case, okay? And then just slightly to the right and to a little bit lower than the word Siberia, here you can see the word Lukomorye. And Lukomorye is written slanted, like going down. It's not a straight line, it's like at a slant, at a 45-degree slant. Lukomorye. Lukomorye. It's pretty large, you can see it. So that is approximately around western Siberia, maybe also touching the Ural Mountains. And you know what Lukomorye is? Anybody who speaks Russian, when I tell them Lukomorye, they will understand what that means. This is from a famous poem, like novella poem by Pushkin. У лукоморья дуб зеленый, золотая цепь на дубе том. This is the beginning of the Ruslan and Lyudmila poetic novella. It is a fairy tale in which Lucamoria is depicted as this fairy tale land, and from there on, all the great stories begin. Well, I, for example, never knew that Lucamoria actually existed on a map, 16th, 17th century map. Okay, and it's interestingly enough located anywhere between the Ural Mountains and Siberia, Western Siberia at that. Now, another interesting thing here, if you look just directly to the left, to the west of Lucamoria on this map, you will see Pegu Orda, the word Orda. We will return to this. Orda, in Russian, everybody understands, whoever listens to me who speaks Russian, Orda means the horde. You know, Mongol Tatar hordes. Well, what is interesting is that there are lots of these Orda. There was Orda in the Ural Mountains, there was Orda in Crimea, and several other Ordas. And that historically has been always depicted as this Mongol Tatar invasion. And the hordes, you know the word horde? Well, this comes from Orda. Now, I'm going to give you some tips here. We will discuss it in the next episode. Here's your tip. Orda, you might say, okay, I understand the word horde or Mongol Tatar hordes, that rings a bell. But Orda, I have no idea what that means. Well, obviously Russian word. And now look at the composition of this word. We discussed these syllables, word building syllables, this primordial, this like original mother syllables many, many times. It's or ar, A-R, Aryan, right? Or Orion. Remember who seeded the earth, the last seeding of the earth? Orion. Or, and then da. What is da? Yes, we know this, right? How simple once you look at it based on my syllable word building theory. Or da. So or da means, in fact, Aryans. Yes, we are Aryans. Or yes, we're from Orion. It's that ancient of a word. And you will say, okay, fine, terrific, but it still does not ring a bell. I assure you it rings a bell for all of you. All you need to know, I will say this word, the light will go on. Here's the word, order. Order. Orda, that means in more contemporary language, as it was used at the time of the supposed Mongol Tatar invasion, order. These were the people, those were the troops who brought order. And now this is actually a tip for what we are going to discuss later. And this is a bit of a preview, and I will explain what all this means in future episodes. So we will continue. This is map 6. We're proceeding to map 6 now. And again, we are back to the same title for the Septentrional. This map is French again, if I'm not mistaken. It is, yes, it is. Yep. And this map, if you look in the lower center grid of this map, it has the title. It says Le Grand Continent. And Le Grand Continent is the big continent, the great continent, right? In other words, they don't even know, who even cares about naming it? We know this is the continent, okay? Again, returning back to the fact that there are different names here, seemingly they're kind of similar and they repeat themselves. You will see that again Muscovy, again White Russia, again Grand Tartaria, over and over again. You will also see some differences. Some designate this as one, others as another. And that is because it is not uncommon, especially in the old days, it was not uncommon that certain areas of the globe or certain tribes, certain peoples called themselves different names or different, they could refer themselves differently, or different people would refer to them differently. Like if you come from, say, Europe, you refer to the same people differently than if you come from Asia, for instance, right? Or there could be several self-names. And I will prove to you very simply, you don't have to go like very far and refer to the British Isles, the British Empire. Look how many names we have. UK, British Empire, right? If we're talking about the people, or England for that matter, right? Sometimes people just refer to the whole UK as England, which is not exactly correct because it's only part of one of the 4 parts of the UK, of the contemporary UK, right? However, look how we might call the British people. We could call them British people, but we could also call them English very easily, right? Again, not exactly correct, but oftentimes people would refer to them as English, and that creates a certain misunderstanding if somebody is in fact Scottish or Northern Irish or Welsh, right? However, that's what people do. So you could refer to a part of something as the whole very easily. That occurred to everybody. And at the time, that occurred more because they didn't have the internet, you see. And they had fewer opportunities to really map everything out meticulously. Fewer opportunities, let's say. They had some good opportunities, though. We might refer to people as Brits, as Britishers, and there are so many other ways of doing that. Or let's take Sweden, for example. In English, we say Sweden, and they themselves would call themselves Svenska. You know, that's the name for Sweden in Swedish, Svenska. Remember, we discussed Svenska and where it comes from? In today's Russian, свидетель is witness. Свидетель. Svenska, свидетель. Somebody who actually saw something, okay? We discussed it in detail in webinar 8, and it's a very interesting linguistic proof discussion we had. I think it's pretty spectacular to understand these things. So there are different names. We're going back to our map discussion here, and sometimes they don't match. One cartographer decides to name it this way, another, but look at all these matching names nevertheless. So that's a different map by a different cartographer, and they would give you names who designed this specific map. This one is designed by Duroy. Okay, that's the name of this guy, Paris. It says here at the bottom, I believe. And again, Grand Tartarie, the Great Tartaria or Grand Tartaria. Now, Europe here, you see on the left, extends already all the way into Moscovia. Here it's called Moscovia. See, it does not say White Russia per se. Also, look at the ocean, Océan Septentrional, and it extends all the way to the British Isles, which somebody else would probably beg to differ. However, look at the Novaya Zemlya, the island. This is like our beacon for what's what. And look to the left, we still have the Sea of Moscow, and to the right we still have the Sea of Tartaria. That has not changed, although in the boundaries of the Arctic Circle and Tartaria have changed a little bit. You have Kamchatskaya Sea over there on in the very upper right corner. You have all that. And here it says Europe already, because that's apparently a slightly later map. No, it's 1684. Yeah, it's about the same time frame. So Europe already extends into Moscow and Moscovia territory, and Asia, Asia, is marked as we would understand Asia today. However, it's still Grand Tartaria that is occupying the largest part of the whole Siberia, Far East, and part of Southeast Asia even. China is a lot smaller, India is different, and of course the boundaries of everything are different. The coastline, everything is different, but close enough. It's rather recognizable, in fact. Okay, so this is what this map tells us. Well, that's all basically as far as old maps go that I wanted to show you, and you can study them yourself. And now, remember everything we discussed, and let's proceed to the contemporary maps. And map number 7 is basically Eurasia as we know it today. Of course, this is not the true shape of Eurasia because it's stretched as a map. In reality, Russia would look more compact, and it would look a little bit more like circled, you know, Arctic Ocean. It kind of like hugs the Arctic Ocean on a large chunk of the Arctic Ocean. And you will see here that You see the Arctic Circle on this map where it's indicated. So most of the things that we discussed were either Siberia, the Urals, or the Far East, and a lot of it was beyond the Arctic Circle, where the Arctic Sea is. You see Novaya Zemlya again there. And now we're getting to the interesting thing. Look at map number 8. It shows in more detail everything that is happening in the Arctic Ocean. Okay, again, Novaya Zemlya, notice where it's located. It is just north of what it says here, Uralsky Khrebet, which is the Ural Mountains, just north of it in the Arctic Ocean. Now look to the left of it, and you see, what is the name of the sea? That's contemporary name, Barents Sea. Look to the right of it, and you will see Kara Sea. And then you have more islands, more seas, the Laptev Sea, the East Siberian Sea, etc. So what happened to Moscovia Sea and the Tartaria Sea, which were located on two sides of Novaya Zemlya? Well, I was actually fascinated by this, and I was really curious what happened to it. What happened to the old names? And I actually went on Wikipedia, which I usually don't recommend, but this was handy. And I was hoping that I would at least find out some basic data here. So I wanted to find out what happened to the original name. Believe it or not, on Wikipedia, if you type in Barents Sea, it is not even mentioned that it was in fact the Sea of Moscovia at one point. In their own maps, you know, Western maps. So the name, it says here, history. The Barents Sea was formerly known to Russians, note, to Russians, not to Europeans, only to Russians, as Murmanskое море, or the Sea of Murmans. In other words, Norwegians. And it appears with this name in 16th century maps, including Gerard Mercator map of the Arctic published in 1595. Oh, really? I just showed you maps from what century? 16th and 17th. And what is the name of the sea there? The Sea of Moscovia, not the Sea of Murmansk. Okay, now let's check the data on whether Murmans were in fact Norwegians. They could have been in part, but look again at our map. What do we see here? Look at the Kola Peninsula, which is part of Russia. Look at what is the name of the city there on the shore of the Barents Sea. It is called Murmansk, Russian city of Murmansk. Incidentally, the seat of Russia's Northern Fleet. Very famous seat of Russia's Northern Fleet. Lots of very secret subs there, lots of stuff. It's a closed city. Not everybody can get in there. Yes, it's very close to the border with Norway and this is part of the Scandinavia, of course. Murmansk is located in the Scandinavian peninsula as a whole. If we think about it this way, yeah, sure, that whole tribe living around Murmansk and extending all the way into Norway in the ancient days could have been called Murmans. And now let's remember, what did I explain to you in webinar 8 about what does the word man mean? This is a very international, very primordial mother word. One of those mother, remember manna, you know, the Chinese word man, which means 10,000. It just pierces, just goes, makes a mark in every single language. You know, there's the word shaman, which is supposed to be a Turkic word, basically Central Asian or Siberian. Chinese word man, you know, it's everywhere, right? So Murman, these are people or men. And what is Mur? That's More, Mar. Remember Mara, the goddess of death and rebirth? So it was not Murman, it was Moreman, the sea people, in other words, or very northern people, incidentally, where nights are very low. It extends into like 6 months. So there are Arctic nights, are very long day, very long night. So Mara actually comes into that. That goddess that rules the death and rebirth comes into this. And you remember I drew the parallel between Mara and the sea, what is called Lamar in the Russian More. So Murmans were those very northern people who live so far beyond the Arctic Circle that they actually live either in permanent night or in permanent day, or close to that, very close to that, and which are the sea people at the very same time. Basically live on the edge of life and death in some ways, because it's such a cold sea, such a cold climate. So yeah, if proves one more time, we talked about Sweden before as a proof that these people, Scandinavians, they're the same Russians. Remember my article, a very famous article, Are Scandinavians Slavs? And that proves it again, yet again. These are northern tribes, yes, and if Murmansk, located on the Russian side, is something equated with Norwegians, then sure, then Norway is in the same category as Sweden and as all other Scandinavians, in fact. Okay, so we've looked at that, and let's read some more here. So the sea was renamed, this is very, very telling. The sea was given its present name in honor of Willem Barents, a Dutch, pay attention, Dutch navigator and explorer. Barents was the leader of early expeditions to the far north and the end of 16th century. Now, let me see. So before that, let's see, great improvement with the sea. The sea was called the Sea of Moscovia, named as such to Western cartographers, including French, Italians, and in Latin, anybody could have done a map. In Latin, it could have been done in any country, as a matter of fact. And suddenly it gets renamed. Does this sound fishy to you at all? And renamed after an explorer. People lived there all this time. They knew all that. So some Dutch navigator and explorer, colonizer probably, I would say, comes there, you know, and just usurps the name. The Dutch were actually very, well, today one might say, oh, they're just such nice people. They were extremely aggressive, just up there with the Brits and the Spaniards when they were colonizing and killing off Africans left and right. So this name was usurped and changed. They gave it to him because he was the one who went there, not the Brits, for example. So he basically claimed the name. There was no problem with the name, right? It was named very nicely in those maps. Suddenly, the name gets changed. Also, look how strange it sounds when we read in the maps that are 16th, 17th century maps, that this is the Sea of Moscow, right? And suddenly we see all this here. Suddenly say, no. Since 1595, it was called something else. The Sea of Murmansk. In other words, there is a lie somewhere there. Do you see this lie? Do you feel it? We cannot prove every single word because a lot of history has been erased from existence. A lot of true proofs have been either hidden or just burned, or just eliminated from existence. And also, a lot of countries are pulling this blanket in their own direction. No, it's my blanket. It belongs to me. No, we discovered it. No, I discovered it. I just proved it to you that the place, that island, Novaya Zemlya, was called Novaya Zemlya back then, in Russian, incidentally. That the sea was Russian Sea on one side, not Russian Sea, it was called the Sea of Moscow or Moscovia on the western side, and the Sea of Tartaria on the right side. Also, to remind you, I mentioned it before, but I also said that the Black Sea, which is way south of what we're discussing right now, in fact was called in 10th, 12th century, and probably later as well, was called not Черное море, which translates as black, but Червное море, which translates as precious red, basically. And also was called, there was another name to it, an even more ancient name than Червное море. It was in fact called the Russian Sea, Русское море. And that name also prevailed for a while until they actually erased it. who erased it? It all came from the West. It was aggressive takeover of all the energy, whatever names they could take over. It was all happening starting in about 17th century. It actually started before that, but a very aggressive takeover of everything, including names and burning documents, and whitewashing and rewriting history began especially in 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. We already did discuss it in our webinar 8. Now, I just want to mention it because this is actually very interesting. Putin just announced that he was starting a focus study and a focus group, and a group of scientists, geographers, people who are explorers and historians, large group of various scientists and researchers is going to work on researching and returning the original old Russian names to all kinds of geographic objects. They will be proving that such and such name in fact was the original name, whether it's in Russia or around the world. Putin tries to be as balanced as possible. And of course, what I'm telling you is very cutting edge. So they're not ready to accept all this, but he apparently already heard enough of complaints of people who said that everything has been so screwed up, everything has been falsified in history, that now they're going to start and returning certain truths to the history. Names will be returned, it will be proven, it will be shown properly. Let's see how far this is gonna go, because it's very nice to hear this. This is like really, really good news. As you see, a lot has been terribly screwed up. I will explain to you in the next episode what is the Great Tartaria, what is behind it, and why is there Moscovia and White Russia separate from the Great or Grand Tartaria, and what is that Mughal Empire which was located supposedly in India. History, it appears in this regard, is also as screwed up as possible and even impossible to imagine. So there is a lot to talk about. Look at the contemporary map, incidentally, see where Moscow is located, Ukraine and Belarus, where Ukraine and Belarus are located. The map number 8 shows you all this. Look what is happening. Well, here the Ural Mountains, Siberia, etc., the Far East. It's not the most accurate of maps, perhaps, but I really like the fact that Barents Sea is so prominently shown here, and all other seas, and Novaya Zemlya. What I wanted to orient you with. Very interesting, right? How all this happened. And now we are going to wrap up this segment. I'll let you study the maps, and we are gonna resume with the next segment.